Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Lauren Davis, and I am here with Dr. Craig Wells, the Heart-Centered Alchemist. We are a husband and wife team, both physicians, both osteopaths, and this podcast is designed around heart-centered people. It is designed to give you a path forward, a way of opening your heart, of moving through the world in a way that is healthy, beneficial for you and the work that you do.
Lauren and I are going to talk about some different ideas that I think are important in the world and important for heart-centered people and important for connection and how to be the happiest, healthy human beings you can be. The first idea that I want to talk about is this just really pervasive and aggressive belief that heart-centered people can't have influence and persuasion and empowerment and can't direct and control their environment. Basically just letting people do what they want without really giving support and direction and leadership and guidance. And I think that heart-centered people more now than ever really need to be in leadership. There are all of these really interesting tools for connection and for influence and to get people to shift their mind and get people to change their beliefs. And that technology is being used by people who are heart-centered. It's basically being used by people who don't have compassion. And the more you're aware of it, the less likely it's to affect you. So there's your own protection and benefit. But there's something really magical that happens when someone who is deeply connected to themselves, they actually get into a state where they can help other people deeply connect to themselves, and they can help, even in the moment, build community and build common goals and build momentum. Because a lot of heart-centered people have really great ideas about what they want to do with the world and beneficial things and things that would be good for everybody. But unless you have the ability to connect with people deeply and get them to see the benefit of your vision, your idea, and be part of the community that brings an idea to life, then all of that basically just ends with you. So being able to communicate effectively and being able to connect with people in a very fundamental way that our society seems to have largely forgotten. That's what is necessary to actually make positive changes in the world, because an idea is just an idea in your head unless you actually put energy into it and you get other people to put energy and actions into it to make it a reality.
And this is a slightly different take on the conversation we were having earlier.
Oh, yeah.
But why do you think that heart-centered people have a fear about expressing this into the world?
So I think people are really confused about influence and persuasion and sales and what it is from a heart-centered perspective and what it's not. A lot of people have very negative experiences, especially heart-centered people, because they tend to attract persuasion predators. They remember being controlled, they remember being coerced, they remember being hurt, and they don't want to make someone else feel like that. And when you're deeply connected to yourself and a sense of divinity, and when you're deeply connected to the other person and their emotions, you're not looking to drive specifically behavior at all cost, right? Because that's what the persuasion predators do, is they drive a behavior at all cost. They don't care about the other person's nervous system. They don't care about the other person's long-term outcome. They don't care about the outcomes for the world. They care about what they want in the moment. And if you can balance your personal need, the other person's needs, and the needs of the community, the environment, the world, then you can create a path forward where there's a deep amount of win, right? So you're winning, they're winning, everybody's benefiting, everybody's getting better, instead of the kind of typical sales model that I think is pervasive, where the salesman wins and the other person loses. heart-centered influence and leadership and guidance and connection, right? It feels very different, right? It feels like a dance. And some people spiral into that dance. And if someone really isn't resonant with you or isn't resonant with the situation, there's always the permission for them to leave, for you to move on, right? There isn't a clinging, grasping manipulation where you're doing everything you can, including triggering primal survival drives to cause an outcome. The other thing is just the ethics of what you're offering and your ideas, right? If you 100% know that you can help somebody, or if you 100% know what you want to do is, and it feels right at a very good, deep level, and you're deeply connected to yourself, and you know that you can trust your own inner guidance and inner wisdom, then it's probably going to work out, especially if you maintain respect for other people's autonomy and authority and their interests and their nervous system good in mind.
So I think consciously knowing that you're doing good would be a barrier to creating the connection that's needed.
Can you explain that idea? I'm not quite getting what you're putting down.
I think that there is a desire for reassurance, right? A deep knowing that this is a win scenario for both of us. I am using my influence and persuasion to set up this win situation. But what is my reassurance that this truly is a win situation? What is my reassurance? How do I know and not fear?
I think one of the most important things to think about is when you are deeply connected to yourself, it gives you a sense of intuition. So when you are deeply connected into what you are beyond a personality, when you're deeply connected into your soul and to your spirit and to the different wisdom principles that can guide you and the different principles that you prioritize and align your life with, you get a sense of how things are going to play out. You may not get all the details, but it's really easy to get a sense of, hey, this is something I should move away from, or hey, this is something that I should move towards. And as you learn to deeply connect with other people, you can start to get a sense for that in the other person as well. And you have more insight, and you have a deeper level of connection, and you have a deeper sense of intuition that it's your responsibility to make sure that the people that you're interacting with are benefiting from the interaction, right? Even if someone is really interested in what you're saying, what you're doing, and you deeply know that it's not going to work out for them, that it's not good for them, you have to move that person along. Or even in close relationships, sometimes you have to put distance between yourself and a person, even when they might be interested, just because there's not enough harmony, right? The goals don't align. The interactions aren't nutritive. Sometimes you have to put space between you and that person, even when they mean well, even when they're good people. So I think the most important thing is to really, in all your interactions, because these are cross-contextual concepts, is to be aware. Because most people, they go through life wrapped in bubble wrap with wax in their ears and a blindfold on, and they're bumping around, right? They can't feel themselves. They can't feel their body. They can't feel the outside world. And I think that's where a lot of the harm comes, right? Instead of compounding interest, we get compounding trauma, compounding pain, and negative experiences because we're not taught how to interact skillfully with each other. And even a lot of the communication experts and things that are talking about right now, they're talking about it primarily from a linguistic perspective. But the basis for all communication is really a subconscious, unconscious, semi-conscious, emotive, nervous system to nervous system, energy system to energy system, synchronization. And then that allows the verbal information to flow. That allows the behavioral aspects of the exchange. And being able to be flexible to the point where you can actually flip a few switches without too much effort in your nervous system to where you can start to think a little bit more like them in the moment. That's what gives communication. So when you take the blinders off, when you take the bubble wrap off, when you take the wax out of your ears, when you can see and hear and feel both yourself, but the environment that you're in and what's going on with other people, you get the ability to be a lot more delicate, a lot more precise, and to move through the world causing the least amount of harm. Hopefully we're doing good, but some days the least amount of harm is what you shoot for. But fundamentally, it goes back to being aware and being connected to yourself, because these awareness skills and sensory acuity skills we have, there's something that's inherent to us and that we're culturally taught to ignore.
Let's go back to the interaction between all of these bubble wrapped people, right? When we finally take off our bubble wrap, when we're trying to skillfully navigate through the world.
Mm-hmm. How can we help other people?
And we're still bubble wrapped.
A lot of people are very attached to their bubble wrap and their blindfold, but being authentically present, being aware and being connected to yourself, having the parts of yourself consolidated and letting something deeply divine flow through. Sometimes that inspires other people to start taking off the bubble wrap. And then once they have interest, they can start developing the skills and the awareness, especially if you have a method of cultivating that. That's something that you can share with people, because there's an interesting dichotomy. So there's the bubble wrap crowd and then the unbubble wrapped crowd. There's really two groups. There are people that use their extra awareness to exploit the bubble wrap people and to basically milk them for all they're worth and to control and direct and herd and get them to do what they want, even though it may not be good for them. And then there are the people that want to tend. They want to nurture. They want to prune when appropriate and move in a way where they don't excessively bump into people, but they still maintain their space. Most people are bouncing around blindly because they don't have an inner compass, they don't have a direction, and they don't have the sensory awareness to know what direction they're going or who's doing what to them. And the people that do are usually, they're immensely helpful and immensely good for society, or they're immensely bad for people.
Why do you think it is that a lot of heart-centered people, when they become aware, years moving toward nature and a more natural way of living, almost as an escapism from community?
I think that's a big multifactorial thing. So if your emotions awake, if you become deeply aware without navigation skills, then you're still subject to the forces in the environment. Right? So if you can't work your energy, if you can't work your nervous system, if you don't have strategies to deal with situations, you go from being unaware of the trauma and the micro-violences that occur. And I think there's a simultaneous awakening and attraction towards things that are good for you, right? Living in nature, living close to nature, or having natural food, growing your own food. A lot of these things they're good for you, right? But they need to be done in the context of community, right? If you look all throughout human history, we typically lived in groups of 50 to 150. Cities are relatively new. They've been around maybe 4,000 years, and certainly nothing like we see now with kind of the mega cities that there's millions upon millions of people. The individual unit, it doesn't. A small family unit would have a very low survival probability. And if you look at hunter-gatherer and tribal people, the common size is between 50 and 100. And everybody knows everybody. Everybody has an emotional connection with everyone. And there's a sense of community and belonging, and everything that you do has a purpose. And you also have autonomy most of the time within the community. So you have freedom of choice, you have meaning, you have purpose, you have connection, right? These are what make people happy. And this is what we're wired to do, putting everybody in their own little ticky-tacky box and separating parents from children. And all of that it's barbarism. It's emotionally and energetically masticating and macerating. But if you don't have the ability to navigate without being excessively harmed the modern world, then you try to build your own shelter. You try to build your own sanctuary, even if it doesn't have everything that you need in terms of connection and sort of social interaction. It still has less pain. I think that also goes into the boundary issue. So if you look at really what makes you able to have boundaries, it inherently comes from a sense of self and a sense of self-worth. And your self-worth inherently comes from having internal cohesion between your parts. And especially if you're neurodivergent and you don't prune neurons quite as well as a neurotypical, you increasingly become more and more fragmented, and you live in smaller and smaller parts of yourself. And it's very hard to have a sense of self-worth if you're not connected to the core, if you're not connected to something underneath your personality, because that core that is you, that's what connects to a deeper sense of spirituality. And not to be religious or endorse any particular religion, but having a sense that you are flowing from something greater is one of the key contributors to having a sense of self-worth. Without a core, without a definition of what's on the inside, and without a sense of being able to feel it so that you know what's good and what's bad for it, not what society has told you is good or bad for your inside, it's really hard to be able to set boundaries, right? So there's kind of one issue is if we don't feel good, if we don't feel ourselves and we don't feel good inside ourselves, we either make everyone else want to feel bad or we try to make everyone else feel good when it's not necessarily our responsibility. We don't have a sense of what's good and bad for us. We don't have a sense of where our edges are. And we also tend to get a lot of unconscious reactivity. And that makes skillful negotiation of boundaries pretty impossible, right? Because you tend to get triggered by situations. So having the ability to, in a very conscious manner, negotiate your boundaries with people in a way that's palatable to them means that you get more of what you want. There, especially in the female world, right? There's this misconception, oh, he would just know. If they really love me, they really care. They would just know that I need this and this. When there hasn't really been any sort of outward expression of that. When we're all blind and we're also not talking to each other in a way that the other person can hear. I think a lot of times one person's speaking Elven and the other person's speaking Murmish, and it just doesn't translate. So the boundary issues, it's a big thing. And so we also get scared to enforce boundaries because bad things happen. People get angry. People move out of our life. There's trauma associated with it because, unfortunately, people in authority, and especially men, are taught to transgress boundaries, right? So they're barely taught to listen to blatant no's, and they're actively encouraged to the little subtle no's. They're actively taught to ignore, and being able to sense an unspoken no for someone who's heart-centered, I think is deeply important. And then you have the choice when you get an unspoken no. Do you withdraw that attention, that action? Do you move forward in a different direction? Once you encounter an unconscious no, right, and you're starting to sense that duress and that activation in a negative way in the other person's nervous system, then do I need to change the direction of the conversation to we need to do a different activity? To bring things up more indirectly? Do I just need to stop and pause and then let the other person be or do whatever they're going to do instead of bulldozing through it? Though I feel sometimes skillfully dancing around the bulldozers, I feel a bit like a bullfighter. You just got to keep dodging.
It's a good thing you studied martial arts. Make one hell of a bullfighter.
Completely totally tangential to what we're talking about. But that was actually one of the things some of the classical Japanese karate used to do is they used to go punch a bull in the head and get him to drop dead. I don't necessarily think that's really the best use of your skills and abilities, but I like a lot of the internal martial arts, especially Bakwa, which is what Lauren was talking about, because it looks at a bunch of different polarities and a bunch of different strategies. Some of them are very soft. Some of them are very hard. And it gives you a range of options. The awareness and the energy skills from those internal martial arts are very cross-contextual. So they apply to everything from conversation to love making to your own health and wellness and healing practices, that kind of thing.
So if we want to skillfully navigate influence, what tools do we need in our tool belt?
I think the biggest and most fundamental thing is one, a coherent core, right? If you don't have a coherent core, even if you have everything else, you're more likely to do harm. You're more likely to be harmful. The other thing, in addition to a core, is your inner wisdom. So your GPS, your compass, your North Star, your guidance system. And once you have those, once you have the sonar and the radar and the map, you need sensory acuity. You need different types of awareness skills that are inherently human that we're just cultured out of because it's just not useful to the persuasion predators that we have to navigate the environment and respond with conscious choice as opposed to responding with unconscious, automated, largely trauma-based responses.
This is something we talked about before, but how do you see fear disrupting alignment?
So fear is a very contractile emotion and it shuts down our energy, right? It withdraws our energy. And if you get enough fear, it even withdraws your awareness. If we are in a deeply fearful state, it actually shuts off the part of the brain and the neurology that allows connection to happen and the overlapping of the different energy bodies and energy fields that surround us. The fear actually collapses those. So if you're deeply fearful, you don't have a medium for communication and exchange of information, nervous system to nervous system. And the parts of the nervous system, like your mirror neurons and different aspects of your limbic system, they either turn the volume gets cranked up too loud or it gets turned way off. And fear is one thing that tends to turn off the frontal lobe. You lose all your sensory acuity, you lose rational thought, you lose access to your emotions, you lose access to feeling and interpreting to the best of your ability other people's emotion. I think there's an interesting sideline here where we're told that we can never really know another person. And I think there is some truth to that, right? We've been together 10 years more, and we're still learning things about each other. The Taoists have a saying, and I'm probably butchering it because I've heard several different versions of it, but it's 10 years to learn the body, 10 years to learn the mind, 10 years to learn the spirit or the soul of another person. I do think there's validity in knowing someone's depths, but we are social communal creatures. We are wired to, at a basic level, know what other people are feeling, right? I think we're wired for nervous systems to synchronize. So, a bit of a sci-fi fan, and that's actually one of the big lines in Dune is fear is the mind killer. There's always classic Yoda wisdom. The fear leads to the dark side. because it disconnects you from your heart. It disconnects you from your core, right? It disconnects the conscious mind from the deep inner essence. And if a saber-toothed tiger jumps out, right, be afraid, right? Big toothy cat, I'm going to chase you down. We don't necessarily need to unpack our soul mission and our deep feelings at that moment. We need to get to safety. We need to scare the thing away, or we need to run away.
The thing that keeps coming up for me in my mind, you and I both, I don't think, consider ourselves Western medicine practitioners.
We're reluctantly Western medicine trained. How about that?
The first tenet of Western medicine is first, do no harm.
Oh, yeah.
So the thing we put above all in Western medicine is fear.
Mm.
How does that impact a therapeutic relationship?
There's a lot of fear in the medical community, and they won't really talk about it. So we are deeply afraid of hurting people and doing the wrong thing. And we're pressured to move faster and do more with less. And we're also afraid of our patients. We're afraid of being sued. We're afraid of negative interactions. We're afraid of stress. So we're afraid of and afraid for.
I'm afraid of the negative Google review.
Yeah, so we're both afraid for our patients' well-being and afraid of what a negative patient interaction or encounter is going to do to us. Fundamentally, what's transformative is a connection, right? So either you're connecting with a person and that's transformative, or you're connecting with an idea and you're internalizing it and you're connecting with different energies and different resources, or connecting different parts of yourself, right? And that's what causes the transformation, because there's so much fear and then bluster spackled over the fear. You're just not going to find that in most physicians and mainstream medicine. And because of that, the healing relationship is severely limited. And there's been a lot of research into this, that most chronic disease, most chronic pain, and especially most autoimmune disease are deeply psycho-emotional, right? They may not be 100% psycho-emotional, but they are deeply driven by it. And until that psycho-emotional component is resolved, until the island of a person is put back together and there's cultivation of the whole person in some regard, a lot of times you can't fix the problems. And that's why I think less of a medical relationship and more of just a whole person cultivating yourself approach, right? Doing work around connecting a person with themselves and teaching them to feel and clear their energy and how to have healthy, deep relationships is going to prevent and cure more disease than most doctors ever will.
Last thing, I'd like to explain the island metaphor.
The island.
Community metaphor.
So this is particularly true of neurodivergence, but it's mostly true of everyone. If you imagine that kind of when we're born, we're like an island. It's a little bit untended, but it has a lot of wonderful natural resources. It's got some banana trees. It's got some mango trees. There might be a cool volcano. There's some waterfalls. There's some ponds with fish. There's some cool caves to explore. There's this rich environment. And everyone's is unique to some extent. They all have certain features. And what happens is we build a few little buildings and a few little huts and a few little pieces, and things happen and basically chunks break apart and float away, and we lose access to them. And even the parts that we can access, sometimes we have to take a zip line across, or what's a 2-day canoe ride to get to a particular resource. And one of the things that is deeply meaningful is actually having the skills and ability to put that island back together. Until you as a person are cohesed, and it's not hard, you just have to know how to do it. You can't really be truly heart-centered, because all of the different parts of yourself are having different agendas, and you're not connected to your deep essence, which means that you're not really living from your heart. We talk a lot about toxic masculinity, and it is horrible. It is. But we don't talk enough about toxic compassion, because that self-sacrificing compassion, boundaryless compassion, where we're trying to make ourselves feel good and feel worth, it allows and supports boundary transgressions, and it allows and supports behavior in the world that is just not acceptable. And I think that we all need to be holding each other to a higher standard.
So when my resources are too canoe right away, what happens in my body and my nervous system on that canoe ride?
So there's a bunch of different hallmarks that you'll see. One, you'll see a lot of stress intolerance. So you just won't have the resilience that you had when you were younger. There's a lot of rigid thinking. There's a lot of anxiety. A lot of times the body will feel nervous or jittery. And it also tends to feel pretty drained and depleted. Your sleep's not restorative. You can't enjoy leisure. You can't enjoy connection. You can't enjoy restorative activities. So basically, you go into the just get through kind of work mode. You stay there. So you wake up exhausted. You're not really sure about what you're doing, but you don't really know what to do. So you just keep doing it. And then you rush out the door. You don't like the environment that you're in at work. And then you come home, you're crabby. You snap at your partner. You snap at your kids. Hell, sometimes you can snap at your pets. And there's no joy. There's no satisfaction. Inside, you feel beef jerky. And basically, you just go moment to moment, trying to have as much symptom relief as possible instead of cultivating anything positive. That answer your question?
Yes and no.
So what other aspects and details would you like commentary on?
So if we think of the island,
Yep.
different community members that live on different parts of the island that have broken off, moving into a reactionary part of us that's a different island.
Mhm.
As that shift is happening, how can we self-identify that we're in transition into a different part of us, that we can implement tools and resources to build our...
I think one of the most important strategies and kind of answers to that question is really to preemptively be building the positive core. So you're talking about, hey, I'm shifting into a bad place. What do I do? And one of the most important things is really building the positive core first, and then beginning to, once the positive core is built in a very positive way, work with the grumpy old troll that lives under the bridge and sort of the gremlins and goblins, dark, scary places within you, working with them in a way that is inherently positive, that minimizes those parts of yourself do have to be reclaimed. The old school hypnotic technique for it would be a deeply immersive regression. And a lot of the hypnotists who actually did that, they burned out. They couldn't take the waves and waves of less than positive that were coming off of people. So building the positive and figuring out how to interact with and get the less than positive parts more positive gently is really important. So that's the preventative, tend to the soil, build your infrastructure type thing. In terms of dealing with acute situations, one of the things that you'll notice is a shift in body posture with increased rigidity. So if you're in especially a reactionary fragment, you tend to get the spine will curl forward. Sometimes one shoulder will go up, one shoulder will go down. Similar things can happen in the hip. Sometimes the spine will twist and coil in a particular way, and it becomes fixed and locked. In general, if you're in a state of wholeness, then you have freedom of motion, energy flows. If you're in a very limited part, or expanding the metaphor because we're putting different versions of ourselves on the different island fragments. If you're stuck in an island fragment that doesn't have a lot of resources, its thinking, its breathing, its behavior, and its body posture are going to be more rigid. So if we're stuck on an island, if we notice rigidity, especially rigidity in the body, so that's why interrupting that process with very deeply physiologic things, right? Because in the middle of a boardroom isn't the time to do self-help work, right? When you're in conflict with your kids and you're trying to restore a connection right there in that moment, is not the time to be doing inner work. But what you can do, especially if you have already experienced positive states, you can use the body posture and breathing and memory of positive states to hop you over to a positive island, or to slide you back very rapidly into a more holistic frame. And then you move from there. It's a good thing to note. You're like, oh, this set me off. And then you can do different things to investigate it later. But working directly with the breath and the body and the posture and your nervous system is what shifts you out of the state. If you're in the habit of tuning into your body, then when you get locked up, you're going to notice it, or you're going to feel tension building. You're going to feel things start to happen before they're super apparent, and you can make corrections before you're screaming at your 6-year-old for peeing on the floor.
So I think a lot of the neurodivergent community refers to this as either spoons or your body budget. How is this different than, right? I suppose I think of it as we have a total body budget that is basically sectioned off into these different island resources. If we move to an island, even though our whole body budget may still be there, the resources available on that island are only a small section of that budget.
We're talking about the fractalism, right? But when you're on an island, when you're on a fractal, it dominates the whole nervous system, right? The body and the brain know holism, right? So when that holograph is being energized, it affects the whole nervous system. So when you look at resources, there's a lot of different resources, right? Do you have enough ATP? Do you have enough calories? And if you go without carbohydrates long enough, most people start making ketones. So if you mobilize ketones, then you have enough physiologic resources. Do you have enough neurotransmitters? One of the things that happens, especially with neurodivergent people, is they burn through a neurotransmitter like it's gone out of style, and they don't tend to methylate well. So they can't use the vitamins that they have to make the neurotransmitters in the brain. You get depletion. So there's basically, your body's trying to regenerate itself all the time. And there's certain states that cause regeneration. Most of those are deeply parasympathetic. And then you have states that are spending resources, which tend to be more sympathetic. And there's positive and less than positive sympathetic activation. So if you switch into basically a fragment or a state that is deeply sympathetically driven, like a rage state, you're going to burn through everything you have in your body, right? If you only stay in a rage state for 2 minutes and then you shift into something that's more calm and peaceful, and you give yourself 5 or 10 minutes to build up the neurotransmitters and the neurotransmitter pools, and you relax the nervous system, then you're going to get students back. But when people are looking at their spoon budget for the whole day, they're not typically able to regenerate on the fly. So I think that's a useful thing to think about is, if you're not doing things and engaging in states throughout the day that give you spoons, right? You spend a few spoons, you get a few spoons. That is how you manage your energy. And I think it's also important to recognize there's actually different levels of recovery, and there's even different types of spins. And that gets complex. It's more useful, I think, to pay attention to cycles of activity, cycles of rest, than it is to focus on the spoons. And there's also strategies to be more efficient in everything that you do. If you look at old school regressive hypnosis, where you're fully immersing yourself in a traumatic event to reclaim that part of yourself, that is very energy intensive. Whereas if you can connect with that part in a different way and basically get it to transform from within the inside, then you're actually adding energy, right? But awareness costs energy, and at some point we have to relax our awareness. We have to zone out, we have to sleep, we have to rest, and we have to make those transitions as elegant as possible, because that's what gives us more resources.